Hello, everyone. Welcome to Social 101, Chapter 14, Families and Intimate Relationships. This is your coronavirus e-learning, flexible learning opportunity. So we're doing Chapter 14 now. I'll also load Chapter 15 later today. And our final exam for the class, will be over the last 4 chapters, actually the 4 that are up on YouTube. So that will be our game plan. So let's get started. One of the things we have to do if we're going to talk about families is we have to understand a couple things. First of all, the true function of the family is to rear children, right? Every society has some means, and oftentimes multiple means, of rearing children. So what the family structure looks like is one of the key things that we have to talk about. And so we want something with enough breadth that it can handle all kinds of different sorts of families. And so one of the first words that we're going to use in sociology, and again, as a reminder, we're going to use it differently than you use it outside of the classroom, but kinship. And the reason we use the word kinship in terms of who belongs to a family is kinship does not necessitate biology, right? Meaning that it's not necessary for people to be related to each other. They can simply choose to be together. So we can choose mom, dad, 2 kids, and a dog, right? We can say that that's a family. We can include extended family, aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, whatever shape that may take. Today we have many blended families, right? Step parents, step brothers and sisters, right? Which brings on a whole new host of dynamics. We can also have same-sex families. We have adopted families. We have foster families. There's just all kinds of different families that are out there, and there's no one right way to do this. All families sort of choose their own way forward. Having said that, it continues to be true that the function of the family is to rear the children. And so we've taken, in today's society with a little higher divorce rate, and we'll talk about that later, that maybe this isn't such a recent onset as what many people would lead us to believe. This didn't start in the 60s. This started actually 150 years ago. But anyway, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we want our definition of the family to be broad enough so that we can include all these different kinds of families. Okay. So 2 families I want you to be able to differentiate between on the exam: nuclear family and extended family. Nuclear family is mom, dad, 2 kids, and a dog, right? Or something close to that. I think you know what I mean when I say that. Extended family includes aunts and uncles and grandparents and other family members. But I want you to pay particular attention to extended families also includes multiple nuclear families. Given how many people have been laid off or furloughed over the last month because of this virus that we're all dealing with, it's not going to be uncommon for many people in their 30s, maybe even 40s or 50s, moving in with their parents. If you're married, or if you have children and you have to move into your parents' home because of finances, right? You're going to be living under your parents' roof. Do you think they're going to have any say over how you live your life? You're going to have to navigate that, right? I mean, you want to stay away from conversations where someone is saying, if you're going to live under my roof, you're going to live by my rules. However, if you're living under someone else's roof, you probably are going to have to manage that. And that's why we say with extended families, we want people to understand that there's power plays that are present there. So we also have to talk about multiple nuclear families within an extended family. The people in the class who are already parents know the answer to this question. But which one do you think is a little more convenient when it comes to raising your children? Do you think it's nuclear family or extended family? Again, the current parents get it right away. It's extended family, and there's a really simple reason for it. Built-in babysitting, right? You don't have to call someone from outside the home to come in. You can just rely on a family member. So anyway, there's a positive in there somewhere. On the exam, I want you to differentiate between a handful of terms, right? This is the slide This is the slide on monogamy and polygamy, right? When people say polygamy, they almost always mean a man with multiple wives. But that's not really what polygamy means, right? What polygamy means is a person with multiple spouses. The two kinds of polygamy that I want us to be able to differentiate between are polygyny with an N as in Nancy and polyandry, right? So polygyny, which is the most common, is a man with more than one wife, right? And so polygyny sounds very close to polygamy with an M as in Mary, but polygyny is the most common throughout, right? And so there's a number of reasons to practice this. One would simply be if you're trying to expand your population as a society. I mean, just do the simple math. If you have one man and 9 wives, you can have 9 children a year. If you reverse that, if you have 9 men and 1 female, you can only have 1 child per year, right? So people have practiced these different kinds of family structures to control the number of people within their society. So polyandry, which is where we have a woman marrying more than one husband, right? And so again, when this has been practiced, it's usually been practiced to limit the number of people within a society, to restrict the number of children that are born. So I want you to understand that polygamy is the umbrella, and polygyny and polyandry are the terms that fall under that. Okay. When we talk about the family, we've covered gender issues a number of times this semester. This is another point where I want us to bring gender issues to the front of the conversation. So one of the feminist approaches that we've had with the family is really taking a look at who in the family does what, right? So who's mowing the lawn, who's painting the house, who's doing the dishes, who's cooking the food. And when it comes to the domestic division of labor, feminists rightly have pointed out that maybe men haven't been pulling their fair share. I think a lot of us would agree with that, particularly within the home, right? So when we're approaching division of labor within the home from the vantage point of the feminist approach, then we're taking a look at who's doing what and how much of that is getting done. We also have to take a look at the unequal power relationships within a family. The old show from the 50s, Wait Till Your Father Gets Home, right? That was clearly saying that the father has the power in the relationship. And so if one person is working outside the home and the other person isn't, let's face it, a lot of the time the person working outside of the home is going to have more say, more power about how the money that they're bringing in is going to be spent, where the priorities are. So this would be true whether it's a man or a woman, but it's especially true when it's the man who's working outside of the home. When we talk about the development of family life, I want to get something pretty clear. If we go back 300-400 years, what we consider to be uneasiness or inequality within the family, when you go back 300-400 years, life was really difficult. When we read Shakespeare, we read these wonderful, glowing stories of these people who had all this free time. Shakespeare was writing about the rich. He was writing about royalty. This is really our first class of people who had nothing to do. So they came up with all of these rituals related to when you eat and how you eat, and your pinky finger being held out as you're sipping your tea, and the types of conversation that people had. A couple students so far this semester have brought up the Titanic. If you get a chance to rewatch the Titanic and you pay attention to, I forget the gentleman's name, but when he has dinner with the rich people, as it were, He's constantly being reminded by his partner during that movie. She's letting him know what comes next, right? She's letting him know what's talked about, when the men leave the table, how men are dressed, how they stand, what they do. There were so many rules that the rich came up with, and part of this was so that one who was poor would never be able to pass for one who was rich. So most of our stories from this time frame really focus on the rich people. If we, in sociology, we focus on the other 99% of the population, and these were people who lived really difficult lives. And so most people 300-400 years ago lived in one-room homes, right? And in this one-room home, you had a fire pit, which would have provided warmth for the home as well as cooking for the home. And that was it. Most people had a dirt floor. You've heard the phrase that someone is dirt poor. This simply meant that they couldn't afford a wood floor, right? So it was pretty common for people to have a dirt or mud floor, depending on what's happening. So during this particular time frame, almost everyone was a farmer, right? Particularly in Europe and in the Americas, and so and across the world. But particularly in these areas, people had crops that they had to tend to. So it was pretty common during this time frame for parents to leave a young child, say a child who's 1 or 2, to leave them alone in the home. Again, someone who's a parent so understands this. If you ask your 2-year-old not to do something and then you walk away, I can almost guarantee the first thing that child is going to do is what you just asked them not to do. Trust me, I raised 2 children who are college students right now. I so remember these incidents. So if you tell your child, look, we're going to be working in the field all day, whatever you do, stay away from the fire pit. Pretty decent chance that kid's going to go right for the fire pit, right? Probably not going to survive the fire pit. So when we read these stories of these large farm families from 300-400 years ago, it just wasn't true. 2/3 of all children died before they reached adulthood. 1/3 of children, right? 1/3 of children died during birth or infancy, and oftentimes because families really didn't have enough food to feed another mouth. And so, the stories of children being left on religious doorsteps and being raised by wolves, I don't think any child was raised by wolves. Let's face it, if you put a child out and a wolf finds it, I think we know what's going to happen. But people did leave their children at religious institutions, and sometimes they just left them out back, right? And so that's where the stories of, the child was raised by wolves. No, wolves aren't going to raise your child. They're going to do something else. It was also common 300-400 years ago not to name your child for a year or so, right? So you may decide to name your first child John, for example. And John passes away for a host of reasons, medicine, lack of medicine, all those sorts of things. And a couple years later, you have another son. It's fairly likely you like the name John. It's fairly likely you're going to name your second child John, right? It's a name that you like. People were much more accustomed to death, right? People didn't live as long, so people were much more accustomed. It was also common during this time frame for what we would call boys who were 12, 13 years old to leave home and seek their own way in the world. So during this time frame, it would have been common for someone to knock on your door and say, hey, if you let me stay here and feed me, I'll work for you in the field. And you let them. Can you imagine that today? By the way, can you imagine someone knocking on your door and saying, hey, if you let me stay here and feed me, I'll clean your house, I'll mow your lawn, right? I think we'd be on the phone calling the police at that particular moment. So it was definitely a different world at this particular juncture. So 2/3 of all children died before they reached adulthood. So families were not as large as we think they were, right? So they didn't have birth control. So you're going to have a number of births. And speaking of sex, this is a one-room house. There's no privacy in a one-room house. You think the brother and sisters that you grew up with can disrupt family life when everyone has their own home, their own room here in the suburbs? Just imagine everybody living in the same house and there's no Xbox, there's no PlayStation, there's no Hulu, there's no Netflix, and you're probably not literate, so you're not reading. I think people were bored a good chunk of the time, right? So anyway, so if you're thinking at this point that family life was, oh, this is great, then I am not doing my job right now, right? I really want you to understand that family life for the poor, which is 99% of the population, was really difficult, right? Really difficult. When we get to the 1700s, 1800s, we start to see factories being built, right? We start to see manufacturing start to come in. Up until this point, most people, if not almost everyone, relied on their parents for their livelihood. And what we mean by that is inheritance, right? So typically the firstborn male would inherit everything, and the secondborn male receive nothing. Females in the home didn't inherit anything either. However, when they married, a dowry was given from her family to the other family. And I want to make something clear: we're not talking money, right? We're talking a chicken, a goat. We're talking those sorts of things. But marriages were arranged, and around the 1700s, 1800s. As people were able to begin to leave home and find their own way in the world, and by that I mean economically, then people were less reliant on the old family. And so what that meant was romance, dating for the first time. So once jobs started to become present, education became very important, right? Because people who owned and ran factories wanted people who could read and write and count. And if you could read, write, and count, you're going to make a lot more money than someone who could not do those things. So, interestingly, religious institutions were the first purveyors of education, primarily because they already had it set up. They had a building, they had people, so they had staff, and so this is really how education in sort of a far-reaching way started to grow. It's interesting that our major universities in this country, what we call the Ivy League, Harvard, Princeton, right? Yale, these schools all began as religious institutions, right? They began as affiliated with religion. Now, they're clearly not today, and it would actually be pretty difficult to go back and find ways that they used to be that way. But they started that way for a reason. Religion was something that was already there, that most people attended, and so that's what was used. That's what was used to pass this on. So think about this for a moment. When wide-scale education, K through 12, whatever it was called then, started, for the first time, young people spent more time with young people than they did with adults. So they got crushes on each other, right? You all remember school. You're in school right now. If you put a bunch of teenagers in a room, right, there's going to be all these hormones and emotions, and right, there's going to be relationships and just all these sorts of things. And so the concept of marrying someone that you love started at this point, right? Prior to this. And I remember when I was married years ago, a colleague of mine made a comment to me, and he said, in your culture, he said, you marry the person that you love. And I conceded. I said, yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think we marry the person that we love. He said, in my culture, we grow to love the person that we marry. Those are two very different things, aren't they? They're very different things. And so here in today's world, Oftentimes, the pinnacle of the relationship is really the day that you get married, right? It shouldn't be that way, but oftentimes it is that way. And so, so we're still sort of pushing our way through this. The other point I want to make is, along with romance and education and manufacturing, it really changed how we treat and how we treated children, right? Because for the first time, we recognize that if we treated children well and they received an education, then they can have better outcomes when they're adults. So how children were treated prior to this, we would consider child abuse today, right? But how we treat children has changed with each generation. Every generation says, "Oh, you kids get away with so much more than I did, when I was a kid. My parents said the same thing to me," right? You're going to say the same thing to your children. That's just the way that it goes. Okay. So all kinds of things happen. If we go back to 1900, and if we take a look in 1900 at the number of divorces, right? One of the things we're going to see is this small incline throughout the entire century. Around World War II, we saw a dip in divorce, right? And there were a lot of reasons for this. Euphoria with winning the war. There were fewer men. That probably had a lot to do with it. And this brought about a lot of changes in the family. One of them was cohabitation, living together, right? So in the 60s, we started to see people living together. It had been done before, but it was kind of, hidden because morally people said, "Oh, that's a terrible thing. You shouldn't be doing that." And we really saw a growth of that come around after, so post-World War II. Here's the other thing that we've noticed since World War II, particularly when it comes to divorce. Most people who file for divorce are women, right? Most people, and I mean hands down, most people who file for divorce are women. In sociology, we love to survey people. And one of the questions we love to ask of married people, of anyone really, is we ask them, "Are you happy?" And we ask men who are married, and we ask the question, "Are you happy?" And men just kind of shrug and, "Yeah, I'm happy." Right? Look, someone's cooking my meals for me. Someone's doing my laundry for me. Someone's cleaning the house. It's not a bad gig, right? And then we ask women who are married, and we ask them the question, "Are you happy?" Not only is the answer no, there's a laundry list of reasons why the answer is no, right? And so you know how this goes. If someone tells you the movie is just going to be great, right? It's going to be the best movie you've ever seen, and it's been hyped so much, it's never going to live up to expectations when you go, right? So expectations have a lot to do with this. Men and women have very different expectations when they enter into marriage. Most men have really been encultured to think that, marriage isn't going to be, it's going to be fine, right? And that's it. It's just going to be fine. And so it's pretty easy to meet the expectation of fine. Women, on the other hand, look at the movies, look at the books. Women have been encultured from day one that, the pinnacle of your life is going to be the day you get married, and you want to put all this effort into the dress that you wear and the dresses that your friends wear and all these things. Guys don't go through this, right? So when it comes to expectations, they're very different. I'll tell you what's really interesting with this. When we talk about divorce, my joke has always been, men go kicking and screaming to the altar for their first marriage. They're in an all-out sprint for their second marriage, right? So men who get divorced, over 80% of men remarry within 2 years. Women, on the other hand, waits an average of 5 years. As someone who's been a single parent since my children were 4 and 2, I can tell you now that I understand this better than I did before. And I'll tell you, so part of it is when you get the kids every other weekend, you can adjust your life to handle that, right? You can adjust your dating life, your work life. It's pretty easy to navigate. And if the kids are sick, they're probably not coming over anyway. So it's pretty easy to set up your dating life when you're getting your kids every other weekend. When the kids live with you, everything is different, right? When they're sick, you have to deal with it. But so when it comes to adding a serious dating partner, particularly in a marriage relationship, there's a lot more things to consider. So it makes a lot of sense to me that women wait because, let's face it, most of the time, over 90% of the time, children live with mom. So it makes a lot of sense to me that women wait considerably longer than men. One, you were burned the first time. Your expectations were not met. And two, you really want to make sure that the new person and or their children are well integrated with your family, because that's really the most important thing that you can do as a parent, right? Is to make sure that your family's doing well and take care of your family. So when it comes to things like cohabitation, we see this more and more and more, right? And particularly in times in a bad economy, sometimes people choose to live together just because it's financially more convenient. Instead of staying at each other's apartments every other night or however it is you work it out, it's cheaper to have just one rent payment, right? So, okay, we're just hitting the highlights. Race and ethnicity. I'm not going to delve deep into this because I just want to get you the highlight. You can go through Asian American families, Native American families. Let's do these two, and I'll give you the bottom line to how this goes in every community. In communities where there's high income, we're typically going to see fewer children, and we're going to see lower divorce rates. Asian American families have our lowest divorce rates, right? They have our highest incomes. There's a lot that goes into this, right? But they also have very few children, and they also have very few divorces. The key being the high income. So groups that have higher incomes have fewer children and fewer divorces. Native Americans, on the other hand, our most poverty-stricken group, particularly Native Americans who continue to live on reservations, have very low income. One out of four live in poverty, right? So it's very high. Native Americans also have our highest rates of intermarriage. I think I've told you all of my grandmother. She couldn't wait to get off the reservation, right? So she met someone who was willing to marry her after a few weeks, and it's like, okay, let's go, let's get this thing done, right? She wanted out of Dodge, as it were. She wanted off the reservation. So Native Americans have our highest rate of intermarriage. And again, I think part of that is people want a different life, right? People want to live a different way. And maybe the quickest way to do that is to marry somebody who doesn't come from your background. Having said that, Native Americans also have very high fertility rates. They have many children. We see this across the board. Anytime we're talking about a group that has low income, we're talking about many children, and we're also talking about very high divorce rates, right? I will say that marriage is hard enough. Excuse me. Marriage is hard enough. When there's not enough money to pay the rent and the food, and it's just really difficult at that point. Having said that, I want you to understand something. The number one reason for divorce is communication. Right? It's communication. It's not the first thing that people notice, right? People might notice, oh my gosh, we're not having intimate relations as often as we used to. Well, if you're not talking to each other, you're not going to do that either, right? So that's part of it. You'll also hear someone say, well, we had financial difficulties. Look, if one party is going out and buying things that you can't afford, and then you fight about it later, that ends up being a financial problem, but it started as a communication problem, right? You two should have been communicating about this prior to that happening. And so when we look at divorce rates today, And we see that communication, lack of communication, is the number one reason for divorce. Isn't it any wonder that second marriages are less likely to succeed than first marriages? Look, when people get divorced, often people don't go inward, right? I mean, it would be great if we would all say, oh, I got divorced. What did I do wrong? That's difficult to do, right? So what people want to do is it's their fault, right? If they would have done these things, we would have been fine. Yeah, okay, sure. The other person's saying the same thing about you. So people who don't fix their communication issues in a first marriage are going to have even more issues in a second marriage because someone else is also bringing children into that relationship, most likely, right? And so now you just have all kinds of different ways that you need to be a significantly better communicator, and that's difficult for people to do. So again, communication is the number one reason for divorce, and it's definitely the number one reason that second divorces are oftentimes not as successful, or second marriages are not as successful as first ones. So let me say this. The numbers aren't as bad as what you read about. And here's what I mean by that. If I were to ask the question, what percentage of marriages end in divorce? I think most of you, I think most of us would say about half, right? About 50%, because we've read that in multiple magazines and newspaper reports. And that number is probably in the ballpark, but that's not the key number. Of people who get married and never get divorced, that number is around 70%. Do you get the difference between the two numbers? We use them interchangeably, but they're not. Most people who get married will never get divorced, but half of all marriages do end in divorce. And so what we have is we have a segment of our population who gets married and divorced, remarried and divorced, maybe married again and divorced. And my joke has always been they screw up the stats for everybody, right? I mean, maybe Hollywood is responsible for what these numbers are. I don't know. But my point being that most people who get married never get divorced, right? And so that's a positive thing for me. But it is true that about half of all marriages end in divorce. We don't have great stats on it. I mean, really what we do is we compare the number of marriages to divorces every year. Well, most people don't get married and divorced in the same year, again, unless you live in Hollywood. But having said that, it's probably pretty close, right? I mean, maybe when we've all died, somebody will come back and do the numbers, and it's, maybe it'll be a little higher, maybe it'll be a little bit lower, but it's going to be around 50%. So these are the highlights for chapter 14. You definitely have to do the reading, and if you have any questions, please reach out to me. You guys have a great day.